This video was brought to you in part by the supporters of the AMTV Patreon. Thank you. Hello, and welcome to the Ident Review Extra, the spin-off show that takes a look at one individual ident each episode and gives it the review it deserves. And this time around, we're embarking on a journey through the ITV Network and all the different regional stations that comprised it. Though this time, we've got a double whammy of sorts, as we take a look at the evolution of ITV in Wales and the West. Let's start back in the 1950s. In 1955, independent television, or ITV as it would become known, debuted as the second main TV channel here in the UK, the first commercial broadcaster here, and the first main rival to the BBC. A few years later, in early 1958, the 8th regional franchise of ITV was launched to serve South Wales and the West of England. This would be known as Television Wales and the West, or TWW for short. Extending its coverage to most of Wales by 1964, TWW had the task of providing services for both English and Welsh-speaking audiences, attaining a good reputation for quality regional programming. So with that, let's have a look at how TWW presented its identity during the 1950s and 60s. Another simple yet effective sequence. Like many idents of the day, technological limitations often impacted on how stations could present their branding. Whilst many were still using static caption cards, it's nice to see TWW adopt a more animated presence, the rotating boxes creating quite a striking look on the monochrome sets of the day, and indeed still on modern monitors. This was the predominant ident to be used by TWW in its 10 years of life, though it isn't the original. There was a different image that launched with the station in 1958, but sadly I can't find any footage of it, only still frames. You may have heard me say that TWW was only around for 10 years, and sadly that's true. Due to its surprising loss to Harlech in the 1967 franchise review, TWW would not be able to continue broadcasting in Wales and the West. After an interim period where neither the TWW or Harlech name was used, well that's a story for another day, but eventually, in 1968, viewers in these regions would be greeted to a new name and a new ident. So let's take a look at Harlech. God, you could tell this was made in the 60s. Very quickly, audiences realised that the relative simplicity of the TWW ident was gone, replaced with an ident that wasn't afraid to show itself off. Now, some of you may find the word Harlech tricky to read here, but viewers back in the 60s wouldn't have had such issues. When the ident was designed, it was intended for display on 405-line TVs, so if you were watching on one of those, this would have looked great. However, from 625-line systems onwards, things get a tad trickier, not the best if you have a weak eyesight like me. Nevertheless, I do have a soft spot for the Harlech ident purely for how wacky it is. There was truly no other channel or regional franchise showcasing idents like this in the late 60s, and if you want to make an impression to your new audiences, then why not go all out? This ident wouldn't be in service for long, however, as from the spring of 1970, Harlech would begin operating a colour service and shorten its moniker to HTV.
Matt puts his life on the line for a beautiful woman now on HTV in Baywatch.
You're watching HTV at 6 o'clock, reporting for the West, from the West.
Now some makeover magic.
Very chilly on ITV2 now. Northern exposure. Here on HTV, Paddy and Emily try to defrost.
I'm sure some of you will be familiar with this one. Let's start with the first colour ident used by HTV back in 1970. We return to a more simple structure, with white lines moving into the centre of the screen before finally morphing into the franchise holder's new name and logo, accompanied by either West or Cymru Wales depending on where you were. The electronic score was retained from the 1968 Harlech sequence and would become a consistent earworm for viewers in the region. I do love the HTV logo. It's sleek, stylish, and sort of looks like a TV aerial, a comparison it would frequently gain. This sequence, for all its simplicity and charm, would go on to be HTV's longest serving ident, lasting all the way up until 1987, an incredible 17-year streak. However, like most of the ITV regions, the temptation to upgrade station identities to a more computer-generated affair was just too good to pass on. HTV entered the fray a little later than most, as by 1987, most of the competition and its regional peers had made the jump. However, they came out swinging, and as a result, the 87 HTV ident looks absolutely stunning. It retains the same logo, which I think was a plus, and just makes the whole package feel modern, more sophisticated, and even more appealing to the eye, complete with a more striking musical accompaniment. For me personally, this is the peak of HTV idents. It sadly didn't last long, as just 2 years later, in 1989, this sequence was dropped in favour of ITV's first generic ident, introduced across multiple regions. This used the ITV moniker, with the franchise holder appearing at the bottom of the screen, with part of their logo appearing in the V. It serves as a nice homage to the logo HTV had been using for nearly 20 years, but the generic look takes a lot of the charm out for me. At the end of 1992, the generic look was phased out, and HTV would return to using its own name as its central identity. The new ident that followed in 1993 would be the first to drop the differential Wales and West headings, now broadcasting solely under the name HTV. After more than 20 years, the aerial logo was finally changed to what was essentially the ITV corporate logo at the time, but with the I swapped with the H. Needless to say though, I think it looks really good, quite striking in fact, and I love the blue tones that predominantly make up the image. I think the musical score is a bit of a downgrade to what we had with the 1987 variant, but it still remains soothing to listen to nonetheless. Throughout the remainder of the 1990s, new HTV idents continued to make their way to viewers' screens, all of which retaining the same logo, but each being different in their execution. For me, they all sort of blend into the same mould. They're visually appealing for sure, but there's just something about them that lacks the same charm or striking effect the old aerial idents had. In 1999, HTV would adapt the second ITV generic look, dubbed as the Hearts package. The HTV logo remains the central focus. This time though, the ITV moniker takes the back seat. But you only really see it at the end of the sequence, and the Hearts as a whole are a very mixed bag depending on your preference. Soon after the turn of the millennium, the broadcasting arm of HTV was sold to Carlton, and from the summer of 2001, the HTV ident package changed to reflect that. The Star films used by Carlton were seen by viewers in Wales and the West before a white flash brought back the familiar HTV logo, seen in the same format as with the Hearts package. These are nice and appealing enough to watch, but the inclusion of the Star films really make these feel like Carlton sequences rather than HTV. Unfortunately, just a year later, in 2002, HTV would cease to be seen as an on-screen identity by viewers. This was due to Carlton introducing ITV1 branding for all of England and Wales, effectively meaning several regions of the network would lose their individual on-screen identities and monikers. The old HTV logo, which had been in use since 1993, could occasionally be seen in local news programming for a few years, before even that would be phased out, thus bringing to an end a life on air of more than 30 years. So, after looking at the rough evolution of the TV companies that served Wales and the West, what can we take away from it? Well, for starters, despite having a short life, TWW firmly established a simple yet memorable look for the region, as well as delivering on quality programming. When Harlech took over, despite the shaky circumstances on which it did, it came out swinging in terms of how it looked on screen. After the psychedelic first impression, it adopted more of TWW's playbook, going for simple and sleek, for almost 20 years, with some great refinements in the late 80s. Whilst the 90s showcased that the HTV branding remained effective, by the end of its time in 2002, it feels to me at least like a lot of the personality and heart of those earlier sequences just wasn't there anymore. It's all down to personal preference, of course, but for me, in the 50 plus years of idents that served this region, the ones I favour will remain those from the early days. Simple, striking, impactful, memorable. All signs, in my view, of a successful televisual identity. And so that brings us to the end of another episode of the Ident Review Extra. If you enjoyed this look back at TWW and HTV, then please leave a like, comment your thoughts down below, and subscribe to the channel for lots more ident related content. I've been Adam Martyn from AMTV, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Well, that does bring us to the end of another day here on AMTV. We do hope you enjoyed the programme, and a special thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and to everyone who's tuned in. Until the next broadcast, we wish you a good night.